There are two kinds of people who arrive at a duke's estate. The first kind arrives the way the house expects, with trunks, with servants, with letters of introduction, and the particular confidence of someone who has been anticipated. They step out of their carriage and the house receives them, the way a stage receives an actor who knows their lines. The second kind arrives the way Clara Ashby arrived on a gray October morning in 1811, with one bag, no letter of introduction, and the quiet, unshakable dignity of someone who has already survived the worst part of the story and is simply here now, ready to get on with it. The house did not receive her. Nobody came out to meet the carriage. Nobody took her bag. The driver set it down on the gravel drive, climbed back up, and was gone before the front door had even opened. Clara stood in the thin Yorkshire rain and looked up at Grenville Park. Grenville Park looked back at her and said nothing. 2 years, she thought, just 2 years. She picked up her bag and walked to the door herself. She had not told her sisters how bad it was. They knew some of it. They knew their father's health had been failing, that the harvest had been poor 3 years running, that money was tighter than it should have been. They didn't know about the cards. They didn't know about the years of it, the quiet accumulation of one bad decision laid on top of another until the whole structure had become something that could not hold its own weight. They didn't know that a man from a London firm had come to the house on a Tuesday morning with documents in a leather case and a manner that was professionally kind in the way that made everything worse. Clara had been the one to meet him. Her father was ill in bed, genuinely ill by then, the body finally catching up with the mind's long exhaustion. And her sisters were too young, and there was simply nobody else. The man had explained the situation with the careful thoroughness of someone who had explained it many times before. The debts, the interest, the timeline, the options, such as they were. There were two. The house and everything in it could be sold to settle the debt. Her sisters would have nothing. Her father would die in a rented room somewhere. Or the Duke of Grenville, who held the largest portion of the debt, acquired through a chain of transactions that Clara didn't fully understand and didn't ask about, had indicated that he would consider the matter settled if a member of the Ashby family came to Grenville Park to serve as a state secretary for a period of 2 years. Managing correspondence, organizing accounts, handling the administrative work that apparently required someone with more education than the current staff possessed. 2 years of work. In exchange for the debt, the house, her father's remaining years in his own bed. Clara had looked at the documents for a long time. Then she had said, "I'll go." The man had blinked. "Miss Ashby, perhaps your father." "My father," Clara had said quietly, "is not well enough, and my sisters are 17 and 14. I'll go." She had not told them it had been her choice. She let them believe it was the only arrangement available. It was easier that way. She picked up her bag and walked through the front door of Grenville Park, and she did not look back. The inside of the house was exactly what the outside had promised. Grand, cold, and certain of itself in a way that left no room for anyone else's certainty. The ceilings were high enough to make sound disappear before it arrived anywhere. The floors were pale marble that had probably been beautiful once and were now simply immaculate in the way that things are when they have been maintained rather than loved. A man appeared from a side corridor, thin, upright, somewhere in his 60s, with the expression of someone who had decided decades ago that visible emotion was an inefficiency. "Miss Ashby," he said. Not a question, not a welcome, simply a confirmation that she was the expected variable, arrived at the expected time. "Yes," she said. "I am Mr. Hale. I manage the household staff." He looked at her bag, just once, briefly, and she understood everything about what he thought of one bag in approximately half a second. "His Grace will see you at dinner. Until then, I will show you to your room and the study where you will be working." "Thank you," she said. He turned and walked away. She followed. Her room was small but clean, with a window that overlooked the kitchen garden. The study was down the hall, a dark, wood-paneled room with a desk buried under the particular chaos of someone who had been ignoring their correspondence for a very long time. Clara stood in the doorway and looked at it. She felt, for the first time since the man from the London firm had sat down in their parlor, something almost like steadiness. This she understood. Paper and ink and the satisfaction of disorder made orderly, this she knew how to do. She set her bag down, took off her coat, and got to work. She did not meet the Duke until 7 o'clock that evening. She had prepared for this, not in a vain way, not powdering her nose or fussing with her hair, but in the way she prepared for most things. She thought carefully about what the situation required and arranged herself accordingly. She was neat. She was calm. She had a list of questions about the estate accounts that she intended to raise at the first appropriate moment. The dining room was large enough to be absurd for 2 people. Clara was shown to a seat at one end of a table that could have seated 20, and she sat down, and she waited. William Holt, Duke of Grenville, arrived 8 minutes late. He was tall, taller than she'd expected, with the kind of physical ease that comes not from effort, but from never having had a reason to make yourself small. Dark hair, sharp features, a jacket that had probably cost more than her father's house. He walked into the room the way he probably walked into every room, as if it had been waiting for him, as if the natural order of things involved his arrival at the center. He sat down at the other end of the table without looking at her. A footman appeared with the first course. William picked up his fork. "The quarterly correspondence is 3 months behind," he said, to his plate. "The tenant accounts on the north side of the estate are in dispute. I've left the relevant documents on the desk. I need responses drafted to the letters from my solicitor in London by Friday." Clara looked at him across the length of the table. "Good evening," she said. He looked up, as if the words had been in an unexpected language. "Good evening," he said after a beat. Then he looked back at his plate. "The letters, by Friday." "I'll need to review the existing correspondence first," Clara said, "to understand the context." "The context is in the files." "I'm sure it is. I'll need a day to go through them." "You have until Friday." "Then I'll have them ready by Friday," she said evenly. "I'm simply telling you what the process will be, so you're not expecting them Thursday." A pause. William looked at her again, slightly longer this time, as if he was recalibrating something. "Fine," he said. They ate the rest of dinner in silence. Clara ate everything on her plate, because she hadn't eaten since morning, and she wasn't going to be proud about it. William left before the dessert course arrived, with a brief "good night" delivered to the general vicinity of the table rather than to her specifically. Clara sat alone at one end of a 20-person dining table and finished her pudding. Then she went back to the study, lit the lamp, and worked until midnight. She had said 2 years. She had meant it. But sitting at that desk in the dark, with the Yorkshire wind finding the gaps in the window frames, and the house silent and enormous around her, she allowed herself one honest thought before she put it away and got on with things. This, she thought, is going to be more complicated than 2 years. She dipped her pen and kept writing. By the end of her first week, Clara had 3 things to show for herself. The correspondence was sorted, chronologically, by sender, by urgency, with a separate stack for anything requiring legal attention, and a note attached to each explaining what response it needed and why. The tenant dispute on the north side had been reduced from a sprawling mess of contradictory letters to a single clear summary, 2 pages, with her recommended resolution at the bottom. And the household accounts for the past quarter had been reconciled, the discrepancy found, a small but consistent error in the grain supplier's invoices, repeated 6 times over 18 months, and corrected. She left everything on William's desk on Friday morning, as agreed, and went to breakfast. He didn't mention it at dinner that evening, or the next evening. On the third evening, she set down her fork and said pleasantly, "Did you have a chance to review the correspondence?" William looked up from his plate. "Yes." "Was everything in order?" "It was adequate." Clara considered this for a moment. "The grain supplier has been overcharging the estate for a year and a half," she said. "I've drafted a letter requesting repayment of the difference. I'd call that somewhat better than adequate, but perhaps your standards are higher than mine." William looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read. Not quite surprise, not quite displeasure, something between the two that hadn't quite decided what it was yet. "Send the letter," he said. "I already did," she said. "Yesterday. I assumed you'd want it handled promptly." Another pause. Longer. "In future," he said carefully, "you will wait for my instruction before sending correspondence." "In future," Clara said, equally carefully, "I will. But the supplier's next invoice was due Monday, and waiting for your instruction would have meant paying it in full again. I made a judgment call. If it was wrong, I'll accept the correction." She picked up her fork and resumed eating. William watched her for a moment. Then he looked back at his plate. He did not correct her. This became, over the following weeks, the rhythm of their days. Clara worked. William found more work to give her, in the particular way of someone who has discovered a tool that functions well and keeps reaching for it without examining why. She reorganized the estate's filing system. She drafted responses to 6 months of neglected correspondence with neighboring landowners. She identified a clause in a tenant lease that had been incorrectly written for 11 years and quietly had it corrected before it became a legal problem. Each time she brought him something, he received it with the minimal acknowledgement of a man accustomed to competence being the baseline expectation rather than a thing worth remarking on. Each time she said something he hadn't expected, which was often, she could see him recalibrate. Just slightly, just enough to tell her that she was not, in fact, invisible, even if he was working very hard at acting as if she were. She was not bothered by this. She had not come here to be appreciated, but she had not come here to be invisible either. The matter of the Hollis family came to a head on a Wednesday in November. The Hollises were tenant farmers on the eastern edge of the estate, 3 generations on the same land, the current family consisting of a widower named George Hollis and his 2 adult sons. Clara had come across their file while reorganizing the tenant records and had read it carefully, because something in the numbers hadn't added up. What she found was this. George Hollis had missed 2 consecutive rent payments the previous winter, during the months his eldest son had been ill and unable to work. He had written to the estate twice, both letters formal and dignified, and clearly written with great difficulty by a man not accustomed to asking for anything, explaining the situation and requesting a brief extension. Neither letter had received a response. Now, a year later, there was a document on William's desk. She'd seen it, filed under pending action, authorizing the termination of the Hollis family's lease, effective January. Clara read it twice. Then she picked it up and walked to William's study. He was at his desk when she entered, going through papers, and he looked up with the mildly irritated expression of a man who has not invited interruption. "The Hollis termination," she said, setting the document on the desk in front of him. "What about it?" "You're removing them in January. The lease terms were not met." "They missed 2 payments," Clara said, 18 months ago, during a period of illness. They wrote to explain. No one replied. "The terms of the lease are clear, yes. They're also being applied selectively." She placed a second document beside the first. She had pulled it from the files that morning, half expecting to need it. "The Carver tenancy. 3 missed payments in 1808. No termination. Extended lease, new terms, favorable ones." William looked at the 2 documents. "The situations are different," he said. "How?" A pause. "The Carver tenancy involves a larger acreage." "The Hollis family has been on that land for 60 years, Clara said. "They have nowhere to go. It is January, and the reason for their arrears was illness, not negligence, not bad faith. They asked for help and received silence." She kept her voice level, the way she kept it level when it mattered most. "If you proceed with this, you will be removing a family of 3 from their home in the middle of winter because nobody answered their letters." The study was very quiet. William looked at the documents for a long moment. Then he looked at her, and for the first time she saw something move across his face that wasn't composure or irritation or the mild condescension he seems to apply to most things by default. Something that looked, briefly, like discomfort. "Is there a counter-proposal?" he said at last. Clara set a third document on the desk. She had drafted it that morning along with the other 2. "A repayment arrangement," she said. 12 months, modest additional amount added to the quarterly rent. Arrears cleared by end of next year. No disruption to tenancy." He read it. She waited. "This is acceptable," he said finally. "I'll have it drawn up properly and sent to Mr. Hollis by end of week." She collected the termination document from his desk. He didn't stop her, and turned to leave. "Miss Ashby." She turned. He was looking at her with that expression again, the one she couldn't fully categorize. "In future, bring matters like this to me before drafting the resolution." "Of course," she said. "I mean it. I understand." A beat. "The drafting was thorough," he said. It was, she understood, the closest he was going to come. She received it accordingly. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said, and left.
We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss news stories, please subscribe to the channel. That evening, he changed the Hollis decision. He did not tell her. He didn't need to. She had left the counter-proposal on his desk, and when she came in the next morning to collect it for formal drafting, it had been signed. She looked at his signature for a moment. Then she sat down and drafted the letter to George Hollis, formal, brief, and containing within its careful legal language the information that his family was not, in fact, losing everything in January. She sealed it, addressed it, and left it for the Morning Post. Then she allowed herself, alone in the study with nobody watching, one small, quiet exhale. It was around this time that William began to make mistakes, small ones, barely noticeable, the kind that only Clara noticed because she noticed everything and had by now spent enough time in his orbit to understand the difference between his usual manner and something else. He asked her questions he didn't need to ask, about correspondence she had already summarized, about decisions she had already documented. Not because he needed the information. She could tell by the way he received the answers, not writing anything down, not acting on anything, just listening. Once, coming into the study in the morning, she found that someone had lit the fire early. Her usual work fire was always cold when she arrived. She lit it herself and waited for the room to warm. This one was already burning, had clearly been burning for some time. She looked at it for a moment. Then she sat down and got to work. She didn't mention it, but she noted it in the careful internal ledger she kept of things that didn't quite add up. Something was shifting in Grenville Park. She wasn't sure yet what to do about it, but she was paying attention. William Holt had never considered himself a man who watched people. He observed them, certainly, in the way that a duke must, in the way that position requires, a constant low-level assessment of who was useful, who was dangerous, who was angling for something, and what that something was. This was not watching. This was management. This was simply the business of being who he was in the world he inhabited. Watching was different. Watching was what he found himself doing on a Tuesday morning in December when Clara came into the library to retrieve a book she needed for a research task he had assigned her, and didn't notice him standing in the far corner by the window, and spent 4 full minutes running her finger along the shelves with the focused, unhurried attention of someone completely alone. She was humming something, quietly, barely audible. She would have stopped immediately if she'd known he was there, he was certain. Something without a tune he could identify, more of a thinking sound than a musical one. She found the book, pulled it out, read the first page standing up, right there at the shelf, before she'd even moved to a chair. As if she couldn't wait, as if the first page was too urgent to defer. Then she looked up and saw him. The humming stopped. "Your Grace," she said, perfectly composed, as always. Only the very slight pause before she spoke told him anything. "Miss Ashby," he said. She closed the book, tucked it under her arm, and left. William stood at the window for a while after she'd gone. He was not, he told himself, watching. He simply had very little else to look at in that particular corner of the room. The problem, and he was increasingly unable to avoid the word problem, was that Clara Ashby was not what he had arranged for. He had arranged for competence, for quiet, efficient, unobtrusive competence that would handle the administrative backlog he had been tolerating for 2 years and not require anything from him in return except a fair wage and the cancellation of a debt. He had received the competence. That part had worked. The rest had not gone according to plan. Because Clara Ashby was not quiet. She was not loud either. She rarely raised her voice, rarely dominated a room, rarely performed any of the usual kinds of visibility that people used to announce themselves. But she had a quality that William found increasingly difficult to account for. She was present in a way that most people weren't. When she was in a room, you knew it. Not because she demanded attention, but because the room was simply different with her in it. More awake, somehow. More considered. He had noticed this first with the staff. The Grenville Park household had functioned, in William's estimation, perfectly adequately for years. The staff did their jobs, the house ran as it was supposed to run, and nobody caused problems. He had considered this a satisfactory state of affairs. What he had not considered was that adequate and satisfied were not the same thing. Within 6 weeks of Clara's arrival, things had changed in ways he couldn't quite quantify. The morning room was warmer, because someone had noticed that the youngest housemaid always arrived early to lay the fires and had adjusted the coal allocation so she had enough to work with. The kitchen ran more smoothly, because someone had reorganized the morning schedule so that deliveries and preparation didn't overlap. Thomas, the footman who went quiet when no letters came from his brother in the Navy, now received a quiet word and a lighter allocation of duties during those weeks. William had not done any of this. He had not instructed anyone to do it. Clara had simply done it, in the margins of her actual work, without announcement or expectation of acknowledgement. He found this deeply unsettling in a way he couldn't articulate. Lord Pel arrived on the 14th of December with 2 hunting dogs, a case of excellent Bordeaux, and the easy confidence of a man who had never once arrived anywhere and not been welcomed. He was one of William's oldest acquaintances, not a friend exactly, because William didn't maintain friendships the way other men did, but someone who had been present at enough of his life to constitute a kind of familiarity. Pel was clever, charming, and possessed of a genuine warmth that William had always privately considered slightly excessive. He arrived in the entrance hall, shook William's hand, and then turned and encountered Clara. She was crossing the hall with a folder of documents, on her way from the study to the library, entirely absorbed in whatever she was reading. She nearly walked into him. "Oh," she stepped back, "I beg your pardon." Pel looked at her with the expression of a man who has been pleasantly surprised. "Not at all. Entirely my fault. I was standing in the middle of the room." He glanced at William, then back at Clara. "I don't believe we've met." "Miss Ashby," William said, with a flatness he didn't intend and couldn't account for. "She manages the estate correspondence." "Does she?" Pel said, in a tone that technically meant, "Yes, I have understood that information," and simultaneously meant something else entirely. He bowed, actually bowed, with the full courtesy he would offer a woman at a formal dinner. "Lord Pel, a pleasure, Miss Ashby." Clara looked slightly surprised by the bow, caught off guard in a way that very few things caught her off guard. "Lord Pel," she said, recovering smoothly, "welcome to Grenville Park." "Thank you," Pel said warmly. "I have a feeling it's considerably more welcoming than my last visit." He said this to Clara, not to William. William picked up Pel's coat from the footman who was holding it, handed it back to the footman, and said, "I'll have someone show you to your room." Over dinner that evening, Pel was, as always, excellent company. He talked about London, about the last parliamentary session, about a horse he'd bought in September that had turned out to be the worst financial decision of his adult life. He was funny about it, self-deprecating, in the way that men who don't need to worry about money can afford to be. And William found himself almost relaxed in the way that only very old familiarity produces. And then Pel turned to Clara. She ate with them, which William had established on her first week, because having her eat separately felt unnecessary and vaguely pointed, and said, "Miss Ashby, William tells me you've sorted out the estate accounts. I hope he's paying you appropriately. He has a tendency to take good work for granted." Clara glanced at William, a very quick glance, barely a second. "His Grace has been fair," she said. "Has he?" Pel said, with the same double-layered tone as before. "Yes," Clara said simply, and returned to her dinner. Pel looked at William with an expression that William did not appreciate. William refilled his wineglass. The next 3 days were, in the technical sense, a successful house party. The hunting was good, the Bordeaux was excellent. The evenings were long and warm, the fire well stocked, the conversation easy in the way of people with no immediate problems requiring resolution. William watched Pel talk to Clara. He did this the way he did most things he didn't want to admit he was doing, obliquely, without appearing to, from across the room, while ostensibly reading, or looking at the fire, or listening to something else. What he observed was this. Pel talked to Clara the way very few people talk to her. Not around her, not about her, not at her. He asked questions and listened to the answers. He laughed at things she said, genuinely, not politely. He disagreed with her about something on the second evening, a matter of estate management philosophy, and they argued about it for 20 minutes, while William sat 6 feet away, turning the same page of his book over and over. Clara was, he had to admit this, in the privacy of his own thoughts, where nobody could see it, brilliant in conversation. When she was engaged, when someone gave her something real to respond to, she was sharp and considered, and, occasionally, very occasionally, funny in a dry, quiet way that arrived before you expected it. He had known this. He had known it for months, in his study, in the dining room, in the library. It was different somehow, watching someone else discover it. He didn't examine why. On the last evening of Pel's visit, after dinner, Clara was reading by the fire while William and Pel talked over their port. Or rather, Pel talked, and William participated at the minimum viable level while watching the fire and not watching Clara. Pel said something, William caught only the end of it, his attention having drifted, and Clara looked up from her book and responded, and Pel laughed. And then Pel said, more quietly, "You know, Miss Ashby, Grenville Park suits you. I think you might be the best thing that's happened to this house in years." Clara smiled, the real one, brief and unguarded, the one that appeared when she wasn't thinking about it. "You're very kind, Lord Pel." "I'm very accurate," he said. "There's a difference." He glanced, just once, toward William. William was looking at the fire. He was not looking at the fire. Pel left the next morning. At the door, shaking William's hand, he said quietly, not quietly enough, "She's remarkable, you know." "She's efficient," William said. Pel looked at him for a long moment with the patient expression of a man who has decided that some lessons cannot be taught, only eventually learned. "Right," he said, "efficient." He climbed into his carriage. William stood at the door of Grenville Park and watched it go. Behind him, somewhere in the house, he could hear the quiet sound of someone moving through the corridor. He knew, without turning around, who it was. He had learned the particular rhythm of her footsteps on these floors without meaning to. The way you learn the sounds of a house you've lived in long enough. He stood at the door for another moment. "Efficient," he had said. He went inside. That night, he sat at his desk for an hour without doing any work. This was unprecedented. William Holt did not sit at desks without working. He was not a man who stared at middle distances or turned things over in his mind or allowed himself the indulgence of unproductive thought. He sat at his desk for an hour and stared at the middle distance. The thing he kept returning to was this. Somewhere in the last 2 months, without his permission, without any conscious decision on his part, Grenville Park had become a place he didn't want to leave. He had spent most of his adult life treating this house as a base of operations, somewhere to return to between London and elsewhere, somewhere to manage from a distance when possible and in person when necessary. He had never particularly wanted to be here. He wanted to be here now. He sat with that for a while. Then he did what he always did with thoughts that didn't fit neatly into any category he had prepared for them. He set them aside, closed the folder in his mind, and went to bed. But the folder, he was finding, kept opening. The letter came on a Monday. Clara was in the study when Mr. Hale brought it in. A plain envelope, no crest, the handwriting on the front that of her sister Margaret, who always pressed too hard with the pen and whose letters arrived looking slightly urgent even when they weren't. This one was urgent. Clara read it twice, very carefully, the way she read everything. Then she folded it, set it on the desk beside her work, and sat for a moment with her hands in her lap. Her father had died on Friday. Quietly, in his own bed, which was what she had wanted for him. Margaret said he hadn't suffered at the end. She said, "We need you to tell us what to do." Clara sat with the letter for 3 minutes exactly. She knew because the clock on the mantelpiece ticked through it, and she counted without meaning to, the way you count things when your mind needs something simple to hold on to. Then she stood up, straightened her work into a neat pile, and went to find William. He was in the east parlor, going through what appeared to be a set of architectural plans with his estate manager, a taciturn man named Mr. Cross, who communicated primarily in short sentences and slow nods. Clara appeared in the doorway. "Forgive the interruption," she said. "When you have a moment, Your Grace, it isn't urgent." It was slightly urgent, but she wasn't going to say that. William looked at her, one of those looks that had become harder to read the more she'd come to know him, because the surface had stayed the same, but she'd learned enough to see underneath it now, and underneath it he was paying close attention. "Now is fine," he said. "Cross, we'll continue this afternoon." Mr. Cross nodded once and left, taking his plans with him. William waited. "My father died on Friday," Clara said. She said it the way she'd decided to say it, plainly, no preparation, because there was no good way to approach it, and she had learned that plain was better than careful when the thing itself was hard. "I'll need a few days to go home and settle some family matters. I can leave a full set of instructions for the pending correspondence. There's nothing critical in the next 2 weeks that can't wait or can't be handled by your solicitor." William looked at her for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said. 2 words, simple ones. She had expected something more procedural, an acknowledgement, a practical response, a question about the timeline. The 2 simple words caught her somewhere she hadn't braced. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steady. She was very focused on keeping it steady. "Take whatever time you need," he said. "The correspondence will wait." A week should sufficient. Clara. Her name. He used it rarely. She could count the times on one hand, and each time it arrived differently, landing in a slightly different place. This time it landed gently, like a hand on a door, not pushing, just resting. "Take whatever time you need," he said again. She nodded once. "Thank you, Your Grace." She left before anything else could happen to her voice. She was gone for 9 days. William did not examine how he knew this. He knew it the way he knew other things he had stopped pretending not to know, with a quiet, involuntary precision that bypassed the part of his mind that would have preferred not to notice. The house was different without her. This was an observable fact, not a feeling, or at least that was how he chose to categorize it. The study was still. The correspondence accumulated in the way it had always accumulated before her arrival, which he had once considered normal and now recognized as a kind of low-grade disorder. The dining room in the evenings was what it had always been. A large room, a long table, a man eating alone. He had eaten alone in that room for years. It had not previously struck him as a problem. On the 5th day, he found himself, at 10:30 in the morning, standing outside the study door for no particular reason. He had walked there from his own study without fully deciding to, following some internal navigation that had not consulted him. He stood in the corridor for a moment, then he turned around and went back. On the 7th day, he wrote 3 letters himself, things that needed doing, things he would normally have left for Clara. He wrote them quickly and badly, his handwriting deteriorating as it always did when he was impatient, and the result was serviceable but graceless in a way that he found, for reasons he didn't investigate, vaguely embarrassing. On the 9th day, she came back.
He heard the carriage from his study, or perhaps he had been listening for it, which amounted to the same thing. He did not go down to the entrance hall. He stayed at his desk and looked at the papers in front of him and waited for the sounds of arrival to settle. The door, the voices, Mr. Hale's measured greeting, footsteps on the marble floor. Then quiet. He waited another 10 minutes. Then he walked down the corridor to the study. She was already there. Of course she was. Still in her traveling coat, her bag not yet unpacked, sitting at the desk going through the correspondence that had accumulated in her absence with the focused efficiency of someone who has been away and is catching up. She looked up when he came in. She looked, he noted this carefully, the way he noted everything about her now, tired. Not broken, not diminished, just tired in the way of someone who has done a hard thing properly and is now on the other side of it. There were shadows under her eyes. Her hair was slightly less precise than usual. She looked, he thought, like herself, only more so. "You're back," he said, which was not, he was aware, a particularly eloquent observation. "I said a week," she said. "It was 9 days. I'm sorry." "I said take whatever time you need." "Yes, but, Clara," he stepped into the room, "are you all right?" She opened her mouth, closed it, looked down at the correspondence in her hands. "My sisters are settled," she said. "The house is... There are arrangements to be made, but nothing that can't be handled by letter. They have what they need for now." He waited. "And I," she said more quietly, "am very glad to be back." She said it to the papers, not to him. But it was the most unguarded thing he had heard her say in 7 months, and it hit him with the same weight as if she'd said it directly, looking straight at him, which she had been very careful not to do. He stayed in the room for another minute, on the pretext of checking something on the shelves, which he didn't find and hadn't been looking for. Then he went back to his study and sat at his desk and felt the house settle around him in a way it hadn't for 9 days. He did not call this relief, but he recognized it. It was February when he made the offer, 3 weeks before the end of Clara's 2-year arrangement. He knew this because he had been aware of it for months, a fixed point in the near future that he had been refusing to look at directly, the way you refuse to look at something you know will require you to make a decision you're not ready to make. He called her into his study on a Tuesday afternoon. He had prepared what he wanted to say. He had actually written notes, which he had never done for any conversation in his life, and which he had then put in the fire because the act of writing them had made him aware of how thoroughly he had lost his bearings. She sat across from his desk, in the chair she'd claimed as hers over 7 months of daily meetings, the one she settled into with the ease of long familiarity, and looked at him with that clear, steady gaze. He clasped his hands on the desk. "Your contract ends on the 1st of March, he said. "Yes," she said. "I'd like to extend it." A pause. Very brief. "By how long?" "Indefinitely." He kept his voice level. "The work you've done here, the organization, the processes, it would take considerable time to replicate with someone else. It makes practical sense to continue the arrangement." Clara looked at him. Not the quick, professional glance she used during working discussions, but the other look, the one she used when she was reading something, when she was deciding what was actually true. "And the debt?" she asked.
My father's debt has been settled. That was the basis of the original arrangement. What is the basis of this one? A salary, he said, a generous one, better terms, your own rooms, your own schedule within reason. I have those already. Better ones. William, his name. She used it rarely. He could count the times, and each one had landed differently. This one landed like a full stop. He stopped. She looked at him across the desk, across 7 months of careful professional distance, across everything that had accumulated in the space between them that neither of them had named. "This isn't a contract offer," she said quietly. He said nothing. "You don't want an estate secretary," she said. "You want me to stay, and this is the only language you know how to say it in." The fire crackled in the grate. Outside, February rain tapped steadily against the windows. Somewhere in the house, a door closed, distant and muffled. William looked at her. "No," he said at last, "I don't want an estate secretary." The admission sat between them, plain and unadorned, nothing around it to soften it. Clara looked at him for a long time. He let her look. He had stopped, some months ago, trying to manage what she saw when she did. "Then you have a problem," she said finally, "because I am not going to stay here and be something you can't name. I am not going to be a function you can't bear to lose. And I am not," she said very quietly, "going to love someone who has spent 7 months watching me without once asking himself what that means." She stood up. "I'm going to pack my things," she said. "I'll leave the study in order. I'll write full instructions for whoever comes next." A pause. "I hope you find someone adequate." She walked to the door. "Clara." She stopped, her hand on the doorframe. "Don't," she said without turning around. "Not if you can't say it properly. I am very tired of almost." She left. He sat at his desk for a long time. The notes he hadn't burned, there had been a second set, written later, which he also hadn't burned because he'd told himself he wouldn't need them, were in the top drawer. He opened it, looked at them. Then he closed the drawer. He didn't need them. He knew what he wanted to say. He had known for months, in the way that you know things you've been refusing to look at, completely, clearly, with the particular certainty of something that has been true for a long time and has only been waiting for you to stop arguing with it. He had spent 7 months being the cleverest person in every room he entered. He had spent 7 months being an idiot. He stood up. She was in her room. He could see the light under the door, and he could hear the quiet, methodical sounds of a person who packs the way they do everything, efficiently, without fuss, getting on with it. He knocked. The sounds stopped. "Yes, it's me." A pause. "I know. May I come in?" A longer pause. Then, "Yes." She was standing by the window with a folded dress in her hands. Halfway through the packing, her bag open on the chair, the room already looking less inhabited. She looked at him when he came in, and her expression was careful in a way it rarely was now, the professional composure she'd arrived with 7 months ago, before he'd come to know what was underneath it. He had done that. He had put that careful face back on her, and he found that he could not stand it. He stopped in the middle of the room. "You were right," he said. "Every word of it. I've been watching you for 7 months without asking myself what it meant, because asking meant answering, and answering meant—" He stopped, started again. "I have spent my entire life knowing what everything is worth. Property, titles, alliances. I am very good at valuation. I can walk into any room and tell you within 10 minutes what everything in it is worth, and to whom." Clara said nothing. She was watching him with those clear, steady eyes. "I don't know how to do that with you," he said. "You arrived here with 1 bag and no name that means anything in any room I've ever stood in, and within 3 months I couldn't think clearly in any room you weren't in. I have been calling that inconvenient for 7 months because I didn't have another word for it." He looked at her. "I have one now," he said. The room was very quiet. The rain continued against the window. The bag sat open on the chair between them. "William," she said, carefully, "if this is another offer—" "It isn't," he said. "I'm not offering you anything. I'm telling you something. I'm telling you that you are the most—" He stopped, because the words were inadequate, and he knew it, and he was going to say them anyway. "The most extraordinary person I have ever encountered. That this house was a place I lived in before you arrived, and is a home now, and I know the precise difference because I've had 7 months to feel it. That I would like," he said more quietly, "to spend the rest of my life being in the same rooms as you. Not because it's convenient, not because you're useful, because there is nobody else I want to sit across a dinner table from, or argue with, or—" He stopped. "Or what?" she said softly. "Or read the first page of a book standing up at the shelf," he said, "because she can't wait to get to a chair." Something moved across her face. The careful professional composure very slowly came down. "You saw that," she said. "I see everything," he said. "That's been the problem." She looked at him for a long moment. The dress was still in her hands, forgotten. "You were unbearable when I arrived," she said. "I know. You didn't know my name at dinner." "I did, actually," he said. "I'd known it for 2 weeks. He paused. "I thought if I said it, something would change." "Did it?" "Immediately," he said. "Every time."
Clara set the dress down on the bed. She looked at the open bag. Then at him. "I'm very difficult," she said. "You are," he agreed. "I won't stop saying things you don't want to hear." "I know." A pause. "I've come to rely on it." "And you," she said, "are going to spend years learning how to be in the same room as another person without managing them." "Yes," he said simply. "I know that too." She looked at him for a long moment, reading him the way she read everything, thoroughly and without rushing. Then she picked the dress up from the bed and put it back in the wardrobe. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. William let out a breath he had been holding, he realized, for considerably longer than this conversation. "Dinner is at 7, he said. "I know when dinner is," she said, not turning around. But her voice had changed, the careful flatness gone, something warmer underneath it, the real voice, the one he'd been listening for since November. He turned to go. "William." He stopped. She was facing the wardrobe, her hands still on the door. "The Hollis letter," she said. "You signed it before I came in that morning." "Yes." "You'd already changed the decision." "Yes." A pause. "Why didn't you tell me?" He considered this. "Because you'd worked it out yourself," he said. "And I thought—" He stopped. "I thought you'd like knowing that you'd got there first." She was quiet for a moment. "That," she said softly, "was the first kind thing you did." "It wasn't the last," he said. "No," she agreed. "It wasn't." He left, and for the first time in 7 months, he went down to the dining room at 7 o'clock, not because dinner was a function to be completed, but because he wanted to be there. Grenville Park in summer was a different house entirely. Not architecturally. The ceilings were still high enough to make sound disappear, the marble floors still pale and immaculate, the facade still certain of itself in that particular Yorkshire way. But certainty, Clara had learned, was not the same as coldness. A house could be sure of itself and still be warm. It had simply needed, for a very long time, the right person to demonstrate this. She was in the garden when William found her. Not the formal garden, the kitchen garden, the one visible from her old room window, the one she had looked out at on her first morning, with one bag unpacked and 2 years stretching ahead of her like a sentence to be served. It was her favorite part of the grounds, which William had never understood, and had eventually stopped questioning, because some things about Clara he had learned to simply receive without requiring an explanation.
She was sitting on the low stone wall with her shoes off, which she would never have done in the first year, and which she did now with the ease of someone who has stopped performing composure for an audience that isn't watching, reading something, her finger tracking a line on the page.
She didn't look up when he approached. She had heard him coming. "Mr. Cross wants to discuss the north drainage," he said. "Tell him Tuesday," she said, without looking up. "He always wants more time than he needs on a first conversation. Give him Tuesday, and he'll have thought through the questions properly by then." William sat down on the wall beside her. "You've never met with Cross about drainage." "I've met with Cross about everything else. The principle holds." She turned a page. "What does he actually want?" "To complain about the cost of the new pipes." "Tell him I'll be there Tuesday," she said. "He won't complain to me." This was true. Mr. Cross, who communicated in short sentences and slow nods, and had never in William's recollection deferred to anyone, addressed Clara with the careful respect of a man who has been proven wrong once, thoroughly, and has no intention of repeating the experience. William had witnessed the conversation that had produced this outcome. He still thought about it occasionally, with the feeling he had eventually identified as pride. "Tuesday," he agreed. She closed the book and looked out at the garden. The afternoon light was long and golden, the kind that arrives in Yorkshire in late July, and makes everything look like it has been reconsidered and approved. "Margaret writes that the youngest has a suitor," Clara said. "Already?" "She's 19. "Is he suitable?" "Margaret thinks so. She has better judgment than she did 3 years ago." A pause. "They'll need to come and stay. I want to meet him before it goes any further." "Of course," William said. Then, after a moment, "Invite them for August. The house is better in August." Clara looked at him. "You hate having guests in August." "I hate having most guests in August," he said. "Your sisters are not most guests." She looked at him for a moment with that expression, the one that still arrived occasionally, when he said something that surprised her. A brief, unguarded openness that she'd stopped trying to hide. He had come to love that expression more than almost anything. It meant he'd got something right without trying. "All right," she said. "August." Inside the house, in the kitchen, Mr. Briggs, borrowed from Ashford Manor for the season, arrangement that had somehow become permanent without anyone formally deciding it, was engaged in a disagreement with the Grenville Park kitchen maid about the correct way to make shortbread. In the entrance hall, Thomas, promoted to under-butler 8 months ago, a decision Clara had proposed and William had approved in approximately 30 seconds, was directing 2 footmen with the focused authority of someone who has discovered, to their own surprise, that they are good at something. In the small sitting room off the library, Mr. Hale was going through the household accounts. He had been going through household accounts in this house for 20 years. He had gone through them differently since Clara arrived, with more care, more thoroughness, and attention to detail that he would never have described as being influenced by anyone, and which had been entirely influenced by watching someone do it properly. He came to a line item, a small recurring expenditure added 18 months ago for additional coal allocation to the maids' quarters, and made a note in his ledger, and moved on. He did not permit himself anything as demonstrative as a smile, but the ledger entry was neat, neater than it needed to be. In the garden, the light was shifting. Clara put her shoes back on, unhurried, without particular ceremony, and stood up from the wall. William stood too, because he always did, which had surprised her at first and no longer did. "I want to walk before dinner," she said. "I'll come." "You have the Cross report to read." "It will keep." She looked at him. "William, you've been putting off the Cross report for 4 days. 5, he said, and it has kept. She gave him the look, the one that was not quite exasperation and not quite amusement, and had become, over 3 years of marriage, something she reserved exclusively for him, which he considered a privilege even when it was inconvenient. 1 hour, she said. 1 hour, he agreed. They walked. The path around the eastern edge of the grounds took them past the Hollis farm.
This was not accidental. Clara had designed the walking route herself 2 years ago, on an afternoon when William had come to find her in the study, and found her instead on the grounds with a hand-drawn map and a set of intentions about the footpaths that she had then explained to him in the same thorough, unapologetic way she explained most things. He had listened. He had approved it. He had walked it with her every week since, which had not been part of her plan, and which she had not objected to. As they came around the curve of the path, George Hollis was in his field, one of the sons with him, the two of them working in the easy synchrony of people who have worked together for years. Hollis looked up, saw them, and raised a hand. William raised a hand back. Clara watched this. "You never used to do that," she said. "Do what?" "Acknowledge people on your own land." A pause. "I acknowledge them." "You nodded," she said. "There's a difference." He considered this with the serious attention he gave most things she said, which was one of the things about him that had taken her longest to understand, and which she now understood completely. He listened. Not always immediately, not always visibly, but always eventually, and always properly. "You're right," he said. "There is." They walked on. The evening was warm, the kind that makes Yorkshire feel like a different country. Generous and unhurried, the long light turning everything gold at the edges. Somewhere on the far side of the grounds, a wood pigeon was making its repetitive, contented sound. "I've been thinking," Clara said, "about the East Wing study, the small one, not your one." "What about it?" "It wants to be a library." "It's already adjacent to the library." "It wants to be part of the library, an extension." She had that look, the one she got when she'd been thinking about something for a while, and had already, in her own mind, resolved most of the practical questions, and was now simply presenting the conclusion. The current library runs out of wall space. There are boxes of books in storage that haven't been unpacked in years because there's nowhere to put them. There are books in storage? There are many things in storage, William. That's a conversation for another day. She glanced at him. "The East Wing study. I'd like to open it up." He thought about this, actually thought, the way he did now, instead of simply deciding. "Mr. Cross will have opinions." "Mr. Cross always has opinions," she said. "I'll see him Tuesday." He almost smiled. "All right. All right?" "I said all right." She looked at him sideways. "No conditions? No provisions? No preliminary report from Clara," he said. "Yes." "All right," he said again, simply. She was quiet for a moment. Not the careful quiet of someone choosing what to say, but the other kind. The kind that she'd allowed herself gradually over 3 years. The quiet of someone who is exactly where they intended to be and has no need to fill it with anything. "You've improved," she said. "I've had a good teacher. You were a terrible student." "I was," he agreed. "I got there in the end." She said nothing to this, but her hand, which had been at her side, found his. Not dramatically, not with any particular announcement, just with the ease of something that had become, over 3 years, as natural as breathing. He closed his fingers around hers. They walked back to the house in the long summer light, through the grounds of Grenville Park, which had been grand for 200 years, and was, for the first time in most of them, also a home. That evening, in the small sitting room off the library, which would, by October, be part of the library, Mr. Hale brought in the Evening Post on a silver tray and set it on the table beside Clara with the particular care of a man who has, over 3 years, revised a number of his initial assessments. "Thank you, Mr. Hale," Clara said, without looking up from her book. "Your Grace," Mr. Hale said. He left the room. In the corridor, alone, he allowed himself something that a man of his particular professional formation would never have permitted in company. He smiled. It was small. It was brief. It was, in its way, the highest possible tribute he knew how to pay. Then he straightened his jacket and went back to work. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.